Hey guys, welcome back to my house. It's been so long since I had you in here. Thank you very much for being so patient while I've been off with my bad back and being pregnant and all the things. And thank you also to the team who have been doing a wonderful job of keeping you entertained and all full of recipes. I've got something really nice to show you today, something which is perfect for just baking at home on a lazy Sunday morning perhaps, and it is for BABKA, but not any BABKA. This is going to be Nutella and chocolate BABKA. Now if you don't know what that is, it is a delicious, sweet, raised loaf. It's a Jewish bake and it is so delicious, and it's basically twisted. Inside the dough is traditionally cinnamon, sometimes poppy seeds, quite often chocolate, but we're going to do it with Nutella because Nutella is really blooming tasty. And it's twisted up, so you get all these beautiful layers and laminations of the flavour inside, and it looks really cool, and it's a really tasty thing to have for breakfast or just as a treat. So I'm going to show you how to do it. So I'm going to start by putting my dry ingredients into my mixing bowl. So I've got 530 grams of plain flour, and I'm going to add 100 grams of caster sugar. And I'm also at this point going to add my yeast, because I'm using easy bake yeast or instant yeast, which doesn't need to be activated beforehand. So I'm adding a tablespoon of that. If you're using fresh yeast or some other kind of yeast, you'll probably need to activate that first. And how you do that is you mix it with the liquid, and the liquid needs to be warm, sort of a tepid temperature, and then you'll add it in when you add the liquid in this recipe. But I'm just using easy bake yeast because it's easy and I like an easy life. Now just give that a stir with a whisk, just to make sure that all the sugar and the yeast is incorporated quite sort of evenly with the flour before you get on with the next bit. Now that should do it. And then I'm going to add the liquid. So I've already got 60 millilitres of whole milk. That's at room temperature. So make sure you don't use it straight from the fridge so it's cold. Otherwise it's going to take a lot longer to activate the yeast once it gets going. And I'm going to add 60 millilitres of water to that. And I'm using a scale just because I find it a bit easier than measuring jugs. Okay, and I'm also going to add my eggs at this point, just because it makes it a bit easier to add all the liquid together at the same time when you start adding it to the bulk. And I've got 3 large free-range eggs. Just going to add those and then whisk them in. All right, that looks pretty well mixed. So I, as you can see, am using my freestanding mixer, and for this you want to be using a dough hook, because you don't want to be using a balloon whisk or the regular paddle beater, because that's just not going to incorporate it quite right. It needs to be sort of teased. If you don't have a stand mixer, you can get dough hook attachments for hand mixers, and they're pretty good. If you don't have any of those things, you can actually do this by hand. And I do recommend doing it by hand with your actual hands, although that will be quite messy. So bring it together with your hands and then kind of get all the dough off your hands somehow. So pop your dough hook on. And then I'm going to put my mixer onto a kind of low, medium speed. And this is where I'm just going to start adding my liquid. And just keep the mixer going round and round, or your hands, until all the dough has come together and is not in little bits anymore. All right, that's coming together nicely. So I'm going to add my salt at this point. I'm going to add 3/4 of a teaspoon. The reason we don't add salt at the beginning is because it can have a tendency to work against the yeast and make it sort of not rise properly. So you add it at this point. And I've also got some butter. I've got 150 grams of soft room temperature butter, which I'm going to start adding bit by bit. All right, that's all my butter in. And now I need to turn this up, because it's gone from kind of doughy to a little bit sloppy, and that's totally fine. But now we need to work the gluten and make all the butter incorporate. So I'm going to turn my mixer up sort of medium-high speed. And I'm going to leave that going for about 10 to 12 minutes. And what you're looking for at the end is for the dough to be coming away cleanly from the side of the table, and the dough to be really elasticy and a bit shiny. So you can see it's shiny and it is elasticy. There's not too much mess on the side of the bowl, so it is ready to come off. So just scoop it off the dough hook. Easiest way to do that is with your fingers, just because they can kind of get all around it. And I've got a really handy tool. This is a dough scraper. You can use a spatula, but this is super handy because you can get right in the bowl and it bends to the shape of the bowl. So gather up all your dough and just plop it in the middle of a piece of cling film. And once it's on, you want to kind of tease it into a rectangle shape, and that's just going to make rolling it out later a lot easier. And then when you wrap it, you don't want to wrap it super tight because it is going to grow a little bit. So just kind of loosely drape, if you will, the cling film over the top so that it has a little bit of room to grow. And then this needs to go into the fridge. And ideally, you want to leave this for an overnight. 6 hours minimum if you're in a BABKA hurry, but I think doing it overnight just makes it all tasty. Luckily for you and for me, I have already made some, so I don't have to wait another 24 hours for my dough to do its thing in the oven. Fridge. So this has had its first prove in the fridge, and you can see it's grown a little bit, not loads because the fridge is obviously cold. If it had been warm or room temperature, it would have overproven and gone crazy. So unwrap it and dust your worktop, and you need to have quite a bit of space for this because it's going to get quite big. So scatter a nice lot of flour over the top so it doesn't stick. And then grab your dough and get rid of your cling film and just pop it onto your worktop, and also you're going to need a rolling pin and flour that too, because this does take quite a bit of rolling because we want to make it sort of a long rectangle, because this amount of dough is actually enough for two, and I'm going to tell you what you can do if you don't want to bake those two a little bit later. But start by rolling it out. You want to keep the width of it about 12 inches? But the length of it, we're going to try and make that more like 24 to 30 inches, so quite long. Because of the size of this thing, you might not want to be picking it up too often. So every now and then, just kind of lift it up and waft a bit of flour back under it, just so that it doesn't stick still. Let's keep on rolling. I've basically run out of road here, but I think this is pretty good size-wise. And also don't worry about the weird misshapen bits because we are going to trim it anyway. So don't worry if it's gone a little bit cockeyed. Now comes the really fun bit, because we're going to spread this bad boy with heaps of Nutella. Nutella is obviously everyone's favourite spread. Chocolate and hazelnut. If you don't want to use Nutella, you can just use chocolate. Or try it with Biscoff. Oh, yeah. Maybe we should try it with Biscoff next time. So I'm going to dollop a generous load all over my dough. Now you might have noticed that I'm spreading it right up to the very edges of the long edges, because we want maximum Nutella inside, but I'm kind of ignoring these wobbly bits at the end because I'm just going to cut those off anyway. Nutella's great and everything, but I think we need to boost the chocolatiness. So I've actually got some chocolate chips. I have pulverized these chocolate chips in a food processor just to make them a little bit more small and bitty. If you don't want to do that, don't worry. You can just put normal chocolate chips in, but I'm going to scatter these all over the Nutella. That's all my chocolate in, and now I'm going to just trim the edges off because they don't need to be there. We certainly don't want to have raggedy edges on our little sausage. So just get rid of those, and now it's the fun bit, and this is going to get a bit messy, but just embrace the mess, guys. So starting at either the top or the bottom, whichever you prefer, gently tease it in on itself, because we are now going to roll it, and we want to roll it as tight as possible. You don't want any baggy bits. Because baggy bits means fewer layers and less Nutella. So as you roll, try not to roll up one end and then the other, because you'll end up with a really uneven sausage. I'm just kind of teasing it left and right. And once you have reached the end, give it a little kind of roll on the counter, but also pick it up a bit and just kind of stretch it just a tiny bit, not loads, because that's going to help bring all the kind of layers together and make it nice and tight. And now it's time to make a decision. So I am not going to bake both of these today. I'm going to save one for another time, for a rainy day when I need babka. So as I said, this recipe is for 2 babka. So start by chopping it in half. Also, you'll have a kind of weird end bit. If you don't want those, just chop them off and get rid of the dough. So this bit I'm just going to put to one side. And ideally, you'd have 2 loaves of the same size because you want to freeze the dough in the loaf tin if you're saving it for another time. It needs to be shaped before you freeze it, and it's really handy to do that because then if you need a babka on a rainy day, you just bring it out to room temperature, and over several hours just let it do its thing, and it will obviously defrost and then it will rise, and you want to rise it just as I'm rising it in normal time, so it will kind of come up to the top of the loaf tin, and then it'll be ready to bake as normal. But let's see what happens. So I've got my sausage. I'm going to use my big long knife and I'm going to cut along the length of it. So this now reveals all the lovely Nutella-y chocolatiness inside, and we want this to be visible. So now we're going to shape the bread, and it's actually really simple. When you look at babkas, it's like, how on earth have they done that? But it's actually really easy. So with the Nutella-y side up, cross one layer over the top like a cross, and then you want to twist, but when you twist, make sure that the Nutella-y bit is always facing up. So I'm going to do a couple of twists at one end and then kind of smush the ends together, and then with the other end exactly the same. Just give it a twist back into position just so that all the stripes are on the top. Oh, it already looks so good. And now you're going to pop it in your loaf tin. I've greased it and just put a bit of greaseproof paper on the bottom with slightly longer edges at the side, just so it's easier to take out once it's baked. And then just gently lift up your twisted babka dough and gently lay it in your loaf tin like a tiny baby. And this is obviously not ready to bake just yet because it needs to have its rise or second proof. So you can do that at room temperature for about 1.5 to 2 hours, depending on how warm your room is. If you have a very cold room, then a neat trick is to put a tray of just boiled water in the bottom of your oven and then put this tin into the oven. It will just create a little bit of warm, humid environment, and it will just do exactly the same thing. So just loosely cover it either with a tea towel or cling film and just leave it to one side. So it's had its 1.5 hours roughly, just growing and rising, and as you can see it is puffed up quite a bit, so it's not quite double, and this now can be baked, and I'm baking mine at 175 degrees C, which is about 190 if you haven't got a fan oven, and this is going to be baked for 30 to 35 minutes, and the way that I test it when it's done is just to lift it gently out and tap the bottom, and if it sounds hollow then it's ready. So while your babka is baking in the oven, at some point during the 30-minute process, you want to make some sugar syrup. And what this is going to do is to not only give it a really nice shiny glaze on top, it will seep in a little bit and help it to stay moist. So very important. So I've got about 100 grams of sugar in a pan here, and I'm going to add 80 millilitres of water and just put that onto a kind of medium heat. And at this point, I am going to stir it. And obviously, if you've watched my caramel videos, you'll know that we never stir water and sugar together, but because we're not taking this to a caramel temperature, we don't need to worry about it seizing or crystallizing or anything. What we want is for all the sugar to dissolve. So when all the sugar's dissolved and it starts heating up, you want to get it to a sort of bubbling, not quite boiling like violently, sort of bubble, and then drop the temperature down just a couple of notches and let it simmer away for a couple of minutes, and then it'll become a really nice sugar syrup. That's looking like sugar syrup. It doesn't change much, it still stays quite liquidy, so don't worry if it hasn't thickened up. You don't want it to thicken up at all. So leave that to one side. So that has to cool down a little bit. Our babka needs to bake. It's nearly babka time, guys. I'm so excited. Right. Oh, that smells so good. Now, we're going to test it just by tapping the bottom. So lift it out with the paper and then, ooh, sounds pretty good. So pop it back in the tin because you want to cool it in the tin. But firstly, we need to put that sugar syrup on it. And we want to do that when it's hot because it does help absorb it and all that jazz. And obviously I've made enough sugar syrup for 2 loaves, so don't put it all on unless you really want a sticky babka. So just drizzle it over the top. Now I know how tempting it is to want to crack open a freshly baked loaf straight from the oven, but it's not going to be at its best until it's cooled down completely. When it's too hot, it ends up feeling really doughy in your mouth, and that's just not very nice. So if you can possibly do this, leave it to cool down completely, and then we're going to enjoy it. That looks amazing. All the layers have kind of plumped and opened up, and you've got all these lovely stripes of Nutella and chocolate. Oh, this is looking so good. Good enough to eat, so I'm gonna have a slice. I'm gonna cut the end off though because I want a nice bit from the middle. Look at the stripes on that. It kind of looks like a chocolate zebra. Oh my God, this is gonna be so good. So babka should be like cakey bread or kind of bready cake, somewhere in the middle. Let's have a go. That is so good. It's the perfect kind of naughty breakfast treat. And it will keep for a couple of days. If you want to keep it, just wrap it in cling film. Don't put it in the fridge, just at room temperature is fine, and it'll keep for 2 or 3 days. And you can toast it. I mean, and you can then also put loads of butter on it. If you really wanted to do that, that would be okay. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. I'm certainly enjoying eating it. I'm sorry I'm talking with my mouth full, but this is what happens when you film and eat at the same time. I'll be back next week, and hopefully you'll give this a go. Please do take a picture because it is so pretty. Put it on Instagram using the hashtag CupcakeJemma so that I can see it. I will see you the next time. Bye.